Welcome to Libeth. Tonight, we follow 3 radically different ways of being in the world. Murasaki Shikibu, the observer, intellectually distant, perceptive, hidden behind restraint. Izumi Shikibu, the passionate, emotionally exposed, unwilling to subordinate feeling to convention. And the author of the Sarashina Diary, the dreamer, formed by imagination so completely that reality itself could never fully satisfy her expectations. Together, these 3 women reveal not simply different personalities, but different strategies for surviving a world that could not entirely accommodate who they were. There is a temptation, when reading these 3 diaries together, to reduce the 3 women to their most distinctive qualities. Murasaki, the intellectual observer, Izumi, the passionate lover, Sarashina, the idealist dreamer. The reduction captures something real. Each of them does embody a particular orientation toward the world, but it flattens what makes each one interesting, which is not the orientation itself, but the cost of it. The way the specific social context of Heian, Japan, both shaped each woman's response to the world, and made that response costly in ways that were particular to her. To understand why each woman was the way she was, you have to understand what she was responding to. And what all 3 of them were responding to, in the end, was the same problem: a society that could not accommodate who they actually were. The problem was structural. The Heian court operated on the principle of managed visibility for women. A woman's value was a function of her aesthetic accomplishments and her social usefulness. Her safety was a function of her willingness to perform the version of femininity the system required. Intelligence was an asset, but only up to the point where it became threatening. Desire was permitted as an aesthetic subject, but not as a fact of life that made claims on behavior. Longing for a different world was acceptable as the melancholy that suffused poetry, but not as a practical orientation that might produce choices deviating from the available options. The managed self, the self that expressed the right emotions in the right register, that performed appropriate femininity in appropriate contexts, was the self the system could accommodate. Everything else was, in one way or another, the problem. All 3 of these women were, in different ways, the problem. Murasaki Shikibu's version of unmanageability was intellectual. She was smarter than the court knew what to do with, not just somewhat smarter, but categorically more perceptive, with a quality of attention to the world around her that the world she was attending to was structurally incapable of reciprocating. The detail that crystallizes this most sharply is the story of her Chinese literacy. She had learned classical Chinese alongside her brother, absorbing it as he received his formal instruction, until her father, who was proud of her ability, who could see clearly what she was capable of, made the observation that has become one of the most quoted anecdotes in Heian literary history. He said, essentially, that it was a pity she had not been born a boy. He meant it as an expression of genuine admiration and genuine regret simultaneously. She records it as both. At court, she hid the literacy. She was explicit about this. She describes in the diary pretending not to know the characters on a screen, performing ignorance that she did not feel in order to avoid the social cost of demonstrated competence. Men found it threatening when women knew things men were supposed to know. Other women found it uncomfortable because it created an obvious hierarchy of accomplishment that the social world preferred to smooth over. Murasaki's Chinese literacy was, in this environment, a liability that happened to be invisible as long as she managed it carefully. She managed it. The hiding of the literacy is a microcosm of the entire situation. She was at all times performing a version of herself that was somewhat smaller than the actual version, performing the appropriate level of female learning, the appropriate degree of social engagement, the appropriate range of emotional response. The performance was not insincere in the crude sense. She was genuinely uncomfortable at court, genuinely shy in some respects, genuinely uncertain about her social footing. But the self-deprecation she performed was larger than the reality it described, because the reality was a woman who could see everything and could not stop seeing it. And that was simply not a self the court could look at directly without some discomfort. What does intellectual isolation actually feel like? The diary gives you an unusually precise account. It is not the isolation of being alone. Murasaki was surrounded by people at all times, as ladies-in-waiting lived in close physical proximity to their mistress and to each other. It is the isolation of having no one who can see what you see. The other women at court are not stupid, and Murasaki does not describe them as stupid. They are socially intelligent, expert at the negotiations of the court world, skilled at poetry, accomplished in all the required ways. What they are not is the particular kind of perceptive that Murasaki was, the kind that cannot turn off, that keeps analyzing what it is inside, that watches the ceremony it is participating in as if from outside it simultaneously. She was surrounded by people who were fully absorbed by the social world in ways she could not be. And the gap between their absorption and her observation was the texture of her loneliness. The novel she wrote was one solution to this. Genji is the world Murasaki could not find at court, a world where emotional complexity was valued, where intelligence in women was recognized as intelligence and not as a social liability, where the interiority of characters was treated as the primary subject rather than as something to be managed into acceptable forms. She built the world she needed because the actual world wouldn't build it. The diary was the companion solution. She documented the gap on the assumption that the gap was worth documenting, on the implicit claim that her perspective on the world she observed was a legitimate perspective even if the world observed had no particular interest in it. Observation, as a mode of being in the world, carries a specific cost. You belong nowhere completely. To observe something fully is to maintain a degree of separation from it. Murasaki attended the ceremonies, wore the robes, participated in the exchanges of ritual poetry, and was somehow simultaneously not there, recording everything from a position adjacent to full participation. The attachment to Empress Shoshi is the one place in the diary where this observer distance closes, where she is present rather than watchful, engaged rather than analytical. That attachment is the most human thing in the diary. The rest is what it is like to be the most acute intelligence in a room designed for something other than acute intelligence. The contrast with Izumi Shikibu could not be more complete. Where Murasaki's relationship to the world was one of careful, costly observation, Izumi's was one of radical presence. She was not watching. She was in it, in the grief, in the desire, in the social exposure that her choices produced. The observer maintains a distance that protects her, even if the distance is itself a form of loneliness. Izumi collapsed that distance. She made the inner life the primary reality and refused to protect herself from the consequences. Her relationship with Atsumichi was not a simple love affair, in the sense that a simple love affair is primarily a private matter. It was a public act, not because she performed it publicly, But because the structure of the Heian court made it impossible for a relationship between a woman of her rank and an imperial prince to be anything but politically legible. The court watched. The court commented. Her reputation, already shaded by the earlier relationship with Tamataka, became further defined by the affair with Atsumichi, defined in the shorthand that Murasaki's diary confirmed. Brilliant, questionable. The questionable was the social record of Izumi's refusal to manage her inner life for other people's comfort. The cost needs to be named clearly, because it is easy to romanticize it from a distance. She was divorced. She was economically exposed in ways that made her situation genuinely precarious. She had a daughter, Shikibu, who also became a celebrated poet and who also died young. Izumi outlived her, which is the kind of loss that no framework makes manageable. The social world that was watching her affair was not watching with sympathy. It was watching with the attention that the court gave to things that were politically interesting, which is not the same as personally caring. She did not have the institutional protection that would have allowed her choices to be made more safely, and she made them anyway, and the diary is the evidence that she knew what she was doing. Passion as a mode of being in the world is often described as a kind of freedom. The freedom of the person who refuses to manage herself, who insists on living at full force. This is partly right and partly romanticizing. What the diary shows is that passion, as Izumi lived it, was not the absence of cost, but the decision that the cost was worth it. That the alternative, which was the managed self, the feeling subordinated to the social script, the desire expressed only within the conventions that made it safe, was a more fundamental loss than anything the social world could take from her. She was not naive about this trade. She was clear about it. The diary exists as evidence of that clarity. The comparison between Murasaki and Izumi is sharpest exactly here. Both were making choices about visibility, and the choices went in opposite directions. Murasaki chose concealment, the hidden literacy, the performed smallness, the withdrawal that made her inner life safe to have. Izumi chose exposure, the published desire, the acknowledged relationship, the diary that recorded her inner life rather than protecting it. Both choices were rational responses to the same impossible situation. Both had significant costs. The choice Murasaki made produced a woman whose extraordinary intelligence survived in the record of a court diary and a great novel. The choice Izumi made produced a woman whose reputation was defined by others for centuries, while her actual interiority survived in a diary that the reputation made it easy to underread. The author of the Sarashina Diary was also responding to the same structural problem, but from outside it. She was not embedded at court the way Murasaki was, nor was she exposed at the edges of it the way Izumi was. She approached the court from outside, from the provinces, from childhood, with expectations built entirely by fiction, and then encountered the actual world, and spent the rest of her life in the space between those two things. The fiction that shaped her expectations was, with a precision that feels almost designed, the work of Murasaki Shikibu. She had absorbed the Tale of Genji before she had absorbed anything else about how the world worked, which means that her model of what court life was like, what men were like, what love felt like, what social belonging felt like, all of this was Genji's model. And Genji's model was extraordinary. It was built by the most gifted psychological novelist the tradition had produced, and it was built around a central male figure of such beauty, emotional intelligence, aesthetic refinement, and moral complexity that no real person could compete with him. The disillusionment that resulted was not cynicism. She never became cynical, which is one of the most striking things about the diary. Cynicism is the decision that nothing matters. What she experienced was more painful, which is the sustained recognition that something mattered very much, and the world was constitutively unable to provide it. She did not stop caring. She did not stop comparing. She kept waiting, in some part of herself, for the world to correct its own deficiencies, for the moment when it would offer her something that matched what Genji had promised. It didn't. The world doesn't. The court service, when it came, was the sharpest single moment of this disillusionment. She had imagined the court as Genji's court, full of radiant, complex, emotionally sophisticated people, saturated with significance, organized around a world in which beauty and feeling and aesthetic accomplishment were the central human values. The court she served in was an ordinary political institution. It had its beautiful moments and its skilled practitioners. It was not without interest. But it was not what she had been promised, and the gap between the promise and the reality was enormous and was felt as such. The men she encountered were not Genji. No real man was or could be Genji, which she knew rationally and could not act on emotionally, because the emotional template was already set. She married, somewhat late, someone who was decent and functional, and not a figure of transforming romantic significance, because there was no figure of transforming romantic significance available in the actual world. Her husband died. She raised her children. She grew old. None of it had the quality that fiction had taught her to expect life to have. Escapism is often described as a failure of engagement with reality, as the choice to avoid the real in favor of the comfortable fiction. This framing misses almost everything about Sarashina's experience. For a woman in Heian, Japan, the fiction was not an escape from available reality. It was a substitute for realities that the social structure made unavailable. Genji offered her a world in which a woman's intelligence and emotional depth were valued, where feeling was not required to be managed, where the interior life was the primary subject. The actual court did not offer her this. The fiction was not an escape from something she could have had. It was a consolation for something the structure of her world would not allow. The three responses, observation, passion, dreaming, are not character flaws or personality types. They are strategies, each one a different way of surviving in a world that cannot accommodate the full self. Murasaki managed the gap through the double life of the observer, performing the required self publicly, recording the actual self in the diary and in the novel. Izumi refused the gap, insisted on the full self at public cost, and paid it. Sarashina lived in the gap, unable to close it or fully manage it, finding in the fiction both the cause of her trouble and the tool with which she eventually understood it. Together, they show us three versions of what it costs to be fully human in a world that only requires you to be useful. What finally unites these three diaries is not similarity, but tension. Three women. Three forms of intelligence. Three responses to the same impossible condition. The attempt to preserve an authentic inner life inside structures that demanded performance instead. Observation protected Murasaki, but isolated her. Passion gave Izumi intensity, but exposed her. Imagination gave Sarashina meaning, but distanced her from reality itself. And perhaps Every reader eventually recognizes some part of themselves in all three. That's all for tonight on Libeth. One new book every week. At least we try.